A policeman beat up Malia Obama, thinking he could get away with it. But a few minutes later, a motorcade arrives at the scene from which Barack Obama emerges. Subscribe, watch other videos, and share this with your friends. Where are you watching from? Write in the comments. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over Washington, D.C. It was the kind of serene summer evening where the air carried a quiet hum, a mix of distant traffic, conversations from pedestrians, and the occasional chirp of birds settling for the night. The city moved with a steady rhythm, its heartbeat a blend of power and history, politics and progress. Somewhere amid this vast, complex landscape, Malia Obama sat behind the wheel of her sleek black sedan, cruising through familiar streets. She enjoyed driving alone. It was one of the few times she felt truly independent, away from the watchful eyes of the world, away from the cameras and expectations that had followed her since childhood. Even now, at 20, she carried the weight of being a former first daughter. People still recognized her, still whispered her name when she passed by. Some saw her as an icon of elegance and intelligence, a reflection of her parents' legacy. Others, those who harbored resentment, saw her as a symbol of something they despised. She had learned to ignore it. Tonight, she had one simple goal: pick up groceries for a family dinner. Her mother had given her a short list: fresh vegetables, some seafood, and a bottle of wine for Barack. She smiled to herself, picturing her parents in the kitchen, laughing together as they prepared the meal. The thought warmed her heart. No matter how much the world changed, home remained a sanctuary. As she pulled into the parking lot of a small, upscale grocery store, she scanned her surroundings out of habit. Years of growing up under the Secret Service's protection had ingrained certain instincts in her. Though she was technically without security detail now, she still carried herself with a quiet awareness. She parked her car in a space near the entrance, turned off the engine, and checked her phone. A few unread messages from her mother, and a missed call from a friend. Nothing urgent. She slipped the phone into her purse, adjusted her sunglasses, and stepped out into the warm evening air. Across the lot, sitting in a patrol car, Officer Bradley Howard watched her. Howard was a man shaped by resentment. His career had been spent patrolling the wealthier districts of D.C., where people who looked like Malia rarely caught his attention unless they were politicians or high-profile executives. Yet, even those individuals irritated him. He had seen too many young, privileged faces who never had to struggle, never had to work their way up from nothing. And then there were the ones like her, young, black, rich, and untouchable. He clenched his jaw, gripping the steering wheel as he watched her move toward the store. The way she walked, confident and unafraid, irked him. He had seen her face before, knew exactly who she was, but in his mind that didn't matter. If anything, it made it worse. He convinced himself that he had a reason to intervene. Maybe she was loitering. Maybe she was up to something. He didn't need much justification. With a sigh, he switched off his engine and stepped out of his car. Malia was just about to enter the store when she heard the heavy footsteps approaching behind her. She didn't flinch or turn around immediately. She had been approached before. People often wanted pictures or autographs, though she rarely obliged. But something about the presence behind her felt different. When she finally turned, her stomach tightened. The officer was a tall man with a thick build, his uniform slightly wrinkled, his expression hard. His posture exuded authority, but there was something more beneath it, something hostile. He stopped directly in front of her, blocking her path to the store. "Excuse me, miss," he said. His tone wasn't polite. It was clipped, demanding. Malia kept her expression neutral. Years in the public eye had taught her the importance of composure. She wasn't afraid, but she recognized the situation for what it was. The officer's eyes flickered over her, assessing, calculating. "Can I help you with something?" she asked. Her voice was calm, steady. She had learned from her father the power of controlling a conversation, the way a steady voice could unsettle someone looking for a reaction. The officer narrowed his eyes. "I need to see some identification," he said. There it was, the excuse, the flimsiest reason for an unnecessary confrontation. She knew her rights. She knew she had done nothing to warrant this, but she also knew how these situations could spiral. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. "Is there a reason you're asking for my ID?" The air between them grew heavier. Howard didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone like her. His hand moved slightly toward his belt where his badge and gun sat, a subtle reminder of his power. "You look like you don't belong here." The words hung in the air, thick and ugly. A spark of anger ignited in Malia's chest, but she forced it down. She had heard this before. She had seen it happen to friends, to strangers, to people who didn't have the luxury of a name that carried weight. She took another breath. "I'm just here to buy groceries," she said evenly. Howard took a step closer. People in the parking lot had started to notice, though no one intervened. Some watched with concern, others with curiosity. A few even pulled out their phones. Howard ignored them. He wanted her to feel small, wanted her to submit. Instead, she met his gaze, unwavering, and that was when he snapped. It happened fast. A hand on her wrist, a yank. Her body stumbling back, a rush of air as she lost balance. Then, a sharp, sudden blow to her stomach. Pain shot through her, knocking the breath from her lungs. She hit the pavement hard, gasping, the shock reverberating through her bones. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Someone yelled. Someone else raised their phone higher, recording. Howard didn't stop. He grabbed her again, this time by her hair, forcing her up. His grip was brutal, his face twisted with something unrecognizable. Rage, contempt, or maybe just the thrill of unchecked power. Malia's vision blurred for a second, but she fought to stay conscious. The world around her had shifted. The peaceful evening, the grocery run, the warm air, it was all gone. This was now something else, something darker. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts as she tried to process what was happening. Then, through the haze of pain, she heard it. A deep, unmistakable roar in the distance. Engines. Loud, powerful, and growing closer by the second. The parking lot was no longer silent. People were moving, pointing, whispering, and then the black SUVs arrived. The sound of approaching engines barely registered in Malia's mind at first. Pain still radiated through her ribs, the taste of blood thick in her mouth. The pavement beneath her felt rough and unforgiving. The world tilted at a strange angle as she struggled to process what had just happened. Officer Bradley Howard loomed over her, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, his fingers still clenched into tight fists. The moment should have shocked him. He had just assaulted a young woman in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, in front of cameras. But there was no hesitation in his posture, no flicker of regret in his expression. If anything, he seemed emboldened. Around them, the parking lot buzzed with tension. A few bystanders had their phones up, recording, their voices hushed and nervous. Others stood frozen, unsure of whether to intervene or simply watch. Malia, even as she struggled to regain her breath, could see the conflict on their faces, the desire to act clashing against the ingrained fear of authority. She had seen this dynamic before. She had read about it in books, watched it unfold in countless viral videos, heard the stories whispered among friends. A black person brutalized by the police, a crowd forming, outrage simmering just beneath the surface. But the difference between those stories and her own was stark. She was Malia Obama. She wasn't just anyone, and yet, in this moment, that fact did not protect her. Howard took a step closer, blocking out the sunlight, his shadow stretching over her like an eclipse. "Get up," he ordered. His voice was low, menacing, almost bored, as if he had done this 100 times before. Perhaps he had. Malia pressed her palms against the ground, pushing herself up with shaky limbs. She was aware of every movement, her own, his, the murmuring of the crowd, the weight of dozens of eyes on her. Her breath was unsteady, her heart pounding against her ribs. But she refused to let him see weakness. She forced herself to stand. Howard's gaze swept over her, cold and appraising. There was something in his eyes beyond mere authority, something uglier, something more personal. "You think you can just walk away?" he asked, his tone sharp with condescension. Malia met his stare, refusing to look away. The engines from earlier had drawn closer, a deep mechanical growl reverberating through the parking lot, but neither of them acknowledged it yet. The officer's focus remained locked onto her, and she understood what he wanted. He wanted fear. He wanted submission. She gave him neither. The tension stretched tight between them, an invisible battle line drawn in the asphalt. And then, with deliberate slowness, Howard reached for the baton at his belt. The movement was slow, calculated, a predator toying with its prey. The subtle threat was unmistakable. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone shouted something indistinct. A few people took uneasy steps forward. Others held their breath, waiting, unsure whether this was about to escalate further. Malia's fingers twitched at her sides, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run, to fight, to do something, but she held her ground. And then, the black SUVs arrived. The air shifted in an instant. Engines roared as the vehicles came to a halt, their tinted windows reflecting the evening sun. Doors slammed open, and the atmosphere changed from one of fear to something far heavier. Authority radiated from the figures emerging from the cars, a presence so commanding that even Howard faltered. A man stepped out of the central vehicle, Barack Obama. The reaction from the crowd was immediate. Gasps, whispered exclamations, the distant click of camera shutters capturing history in real time. Even those who had simply been passing by stopped in their tracks. The former President of the United States was here, and he did not look pleased. His expression was unreadable, but his posture spoke volumes. He moved with purpose, his long strides smooth yet controlled, exuding a quiet power that made the ground beneath him feel steadier. Behind him, members of his security team spread out, their eyes scanning the scene with practiced precision. Howard straightened instinctively, his fingers twitching away from his baton. He hadn't fully registered what was happening yet, hadn't allowed himself to comprehend the enormity of his mistake. Obama stopped just a few feet away from him. The silence was suffocating. The entire parking lot seemed to hold its breath. Howard's lips parted, as if he were about to speak, to explain, to justify, but no words came out. He was still processing. Still coming to terms with the fact that this wasn't just another ordinary altercation, another minor flex of his authority. This was something else entirely. And then Obama's gaze shifted, moving past Howard, settling on his daughter. For the first time, his expression changed. Malia saw it, just for a fraction of a second. The flicker of something raw, something dangerous beneath the surface. It was the same look she had seen in childhood when someone had crossed a line, when someone had threatened his family. A father's rage, carefully contained. Obama turned his focus back to Howard. The officer swallowed, suddenly hyper-aware of how many people were watching, how many cameras were pointed at him. This was spiraling out of his control. He squared his shoulders, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "She was resisting," he muttered. The words came out weaker than he intended. Obama didn't respond immediately. He let the statement hang in the air, let its absurdity settle over the crowd, let Howard squirm beneath the weight of his silence. And then, in a voice that was quiet yet impossibly heavy, he spoke. "Resistin' what?" It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge. Howard hesitated. He had no real answer, no excuse that could hold up under the scrutiny of the man standing before him, no justification that could erase the fact that he had just brutalized the daughter of the former President of the United States in front of a live audience. One of Obama's security personnel took a step forward. Howard flinched. The shift in power was absolute. He wasn't the one in control anymore. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder. The energy had changed. No longer just bystanders, they were now witnesses to something monumental, something that felt larger than life. And Howard knew in that moment that his career, his entire life, had just unraveled. But Obama wasn't finished yet. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them, his presence suffocating. Howard stiffened, but he didn't dare move. The silence stretched, and then Obama said just 2 words. "Wrong move." The finality in his tone sent a shiver down Howard's spine. It was over. The officer's fate had been sealed, not just by the cameras capturing every second, not just by the witnesses who would tell this story for years to come. It was sealed by the unshakable, undeniable truth of what had just happened. Howard had chosen the wrong person to mess with, and now he was going to pay for it. A charged silence held the air captive, pressing down on the parking lot like the weight of an impending storm. The crowd stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and something else, something raw, something shifting. They had seen what had happened. They had captured it on their phones, but now they were witnessing something more. A reckoning. Officer Bradley Howard felt the shift in the atmosphere, the way the power in the situation had slipped from his grasp and settled firmly into the hands of the man standing before him. Barack Obama, the former President of the United States, one of the most powerful and respected figures in the world, a man who had spent his life navigating storms, who had built his legacy on his ability to wield both words and action with equal precision. Howard's body was tense, his breathing shallow. The baton in his grip felt heavier now, like a dead weight. He could still hear the echoes of his own voice, the words he had thrown at Malia just moments ago, the aggression that had fueled his every action. He had been so sure, so certain of his authority, but now all of that certainty was cracking, crumbling beneath the scrutiny of dozens of recording phones and the unwavering gaze of the man standing before him. Obama hadn't needed to raise his voice, hadn't needed to issue a direct order. His presence alone had become a verdict. Howard swallowed, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. His grip on the baton tightened, his knuckles turning white. The instinct that had driven him all these years, the belief that he was untouchable, still clawed at him, desperate to reassert control. And then, just as quickly as the moment had frozen, it shattered. Howard lunged. It was a desperate move, an act of sheer impulse fueled by the last dregs of arrogance. His baton swung forward, aiming for Obama's shoulder, seeking to re-establish dominance through force. But he never connected. One of Obama's security agents moved like a shadow, faster than anyone had expected. In a fluid, practiced motion, the agent intercepted the strike, gripping Howard's wrist with an iron-like grip and twisting it back. A sharp gasp escaped the officer's lips as pain jolted up his arm. Then, with a swift motion, the agent disarmed him completely, the baton clattering uselessly to the pavement. Howard staggered back, his breath ragged, his body rigid with shock. The crowd erupted. Gasps turned into exclamations. Someone shouted, "Did you see that?" Another voice, louder now, called out, "He attacked first. It's all on video." Phones shifted to capture every second, fingers tapping frantically at screens to ensure they were still recording. Howard looked around, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He was losing control of the narrative. He could feel it slipping, see the verdict forming in the eyes of the people surrounding him. Panic flared in his expression, but it was too late. The security agent who had disarmed him took a deliberate step back, his posture relaxed but ready. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't provoking. He had simply neutralized a threat, nothing more. Obama hadn't moved. He remained standing exactly where he was, his eyes locked onto Howard with an unreadable intensity. And then, breaking the silence, a voice rang out from the crowd. "She's bleeding." The words sliced through the tension like a blade, snapping the focus away from Howard and back to Malía. She was still standing, but barely. Her lower lip was split, a thin trail of blood running down her chin. One of her arms was wrapped around her ribs, cradling the pain from where she had been struck. Yet, despite the bruises forming on her skin, despite the way her body trembled from the adrenaline, her eyes remained steady. She looked at Howard, not with fear, but with a quiet, burning defiance. Another murmur rippled through the crowd. A woman took a step forward, hesitant but determined. "Someone call an ambulance," she urged. "She needs medical attention." "I already did," another voice confirmed. The shift was happening. The witnesses weren't just passive observers anymore. They were becoming something more. Active participants, voices that would not be ignored. Howard saw it too. He saw the way the tide was turning, the way the people around him were no longer looking at him with deference or hesitation, but with something closer to disgust. His chest heaved. His mind raced. He had to regain control. With a sharp breath, he straightened his posture, schooling his features into an expression of forced authority. "She was resisting," he repeated, louder now, as if volume alone could make the words true. "I was just doing my job." A wave of outrage surged through the crowd. "Doing your job?" someone scoffed. "We all saw what you did." "You hit her for no reason," another voice accused. "This is all on camera, man. You're done." Howard clenched his fists. He had been in tough situations before, had faced complaints and accusations, but never like this. Never with this many witnesses. Never with Barack Obama himself standing as a living testament to his wrongdoing. One of the security agents spoke into an earpiece, their voice calm and professional. "Law enforcement has been contacted. Additional units are en route." Howard's stomach dropped. He turned back to Obama. searching for some way out of this, some escape route. But the former president simply stared at him, his expression still unreadable. And then he spoke. "Do you know what happens next?" The question was quiet, almost rhetorical, but Howard felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders like a crushing force. He had lost. He knew it. The crowd knew it. And soon the entire world would know it too. A sharp, distant wail pierced the air, the unmistakable sound of approaching sirens, the sound of judgment closing in. The tension in the air was suffocating, thick with the weight of what had just unfolded. The murmurs of the crowd had transformed into a full-blown commotion. Whispers, accusations, disbelief, and outrage colliding all at once. Every pair of eyes remained locked on Officer Bradley Howard, the once authoritative figure now reduced to an embodiment of fear and panic. And then the sirens. A wailing crescendo echoed through the air, grown louder by the second. Howard's body tensed, his jaw clenching so tightly that the muscles in his face twitched. He had spent years believing himself untouchable, knowing that the system would protect him. But in that moment, surrounded by the eyes of a public that would not forget, with every second that ticked by, his certainty eroded. Then came the roar of the black SUVs, sleek and menacing, parting through the street like dark behemoths. The hum of power vibrated through the air, a stark contrast to the flashing lights of the approaching police cruisers. The moment felt surreal, cinematic almost, as if time itself had slowed in anticipation of what was to come. Every person in the parking lot turned toward the convoy. The lead SUV came to a controlled halt. The others followed, forming a semicircle, a deliberate, calculated display of presence and power. The doors of the central vehicle swung open in perfect synchrony, and for the first time since this ordeal had begun, Howard felt something he hadn't expected. Dread. The first to emerge were the security agents, men and women dressed in crisp black suits, their movements measured, their presence unmistakable. They stepped forward with silent efficiency, forming a protective perimeter before the final figure stepped out. And then he arrived. Barack Obama. The moment he stepped onto the pavement, the world seemed to hold its breath. He wasn't just a former president. He was a living symbol, a man who had once commanded the highest office in the country, a man who had shaped history. His very presence carried weight, a gravity that shifted the balance of the moment entirely. His face was unreadable as he scanned the scene before him. He took in the flashing lights, the sea of onlookers, the figure of his daughter standing with blood on her lip, and then, finally, his gaze locked onto Howard. The officer had faced plenty of men in his time, defiant civilians, enraged protesters, even fellow officers who had dared to question his methods. But this was different. This wasn't just any man. This was Barack Obama. And he looked at Howard as if he were nothing. A chilling quiet blanketed the parking lot. Even the murmurs of the crowd had died down, giving way to the suffocating weight of anticipation. The former president did not speak immediately. He did not need to. The silence itself was an indictment. Howard swallowed hard. For the first time since this began, he realized that there would be no easy escape. No carefully worded police report would twist the narrative in his favor. No bureaucratic loophole would shield him from the consequences. Not this time. One of the security agents moved to Malia's side, speaking to her in hushed tones. She nodded, wiping the blood from her lip as she steadied herself. Her gaze flickered toward her father, and for the briefest of moments, the mask of composure she had been holding on to cracked. Relief flooded her expression. Obama's shoulders tensed ever so slightly, the only visible indicator of the fury he kept tightly controlled beneath the surface. Finally, he moved. He took a slow step forward, closing the distance between himself and Howard. The officer stiffened instinctively, his hands twitching at his sides, his training screaming at him to stand his ground. But deep down, he knew this wasn't a battle he could win. Obama stopped a few feet away, standing just outside the imaginary line that separated them. And then he spoke. His voice was calm, quiet even, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath it. "Do you know what you've done?" Howard's throat tightened. His instincts told him to defend himself, to grasp at whatever authority he still held. "She was resisting," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Obama's expression didn't change. If anything, his gaze grew colder. Resisting what? The question was not meant to be answered. It was a statement, a declaration of absurdity. Howard's mouth opened, but no words came. One of the security agents took a single step forward, and for the first time in his career, Howard flinched. It was a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but it had happened. The shift in power was complete. Then, from behind them, the approaching police cruisers finally skidded to a halt, their sirens cutting off abruptly. Uniformed officers spilled out, their expressions grim as they took in the situation. The lead officer, a seasoned-looking man with salt and pepper hair, took one look at the scene and immediately knew. He had seen this play out before. Cops thinking they were above the law, abusing their power in ways they thought would never come back to haunt them. But this was different. This wasn't just any case. This was the daughter of Barack Obama. The officer straightened his stance and approached cautiously, his gaze flickering between Howard and the former president. He took in the blood on Malia's lip, the way the crowd stood as witnesses, the countless phones still recording, and then he sighed. "Officer Howard," he said, his voice laced with the kind of exhaustion that came from dealing with men who had long forgotten what justice was supposed to look like. "You're under arrest." The silence that followed was deafening. Howard's breath caught in his throat. "No, wait. Turn around." The lead officer cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Hands behind your back." Howard's chest heaved. His gaze darted toward Obama, as if expecting him to intervene. But the former president simply stood there, watching, unforgiven. Howard's jaw tightened. He had spent years treating others like they were beneath him, and now he was the one looking up. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned. The click of handcuffs echoed through the air, sealing his fate. The crowd erupted in murmurs, some gasping, others murmuring words of approval. People's fingers tapped furiously on their phones, ensuring that every second of this moment was recorded, immortalized. Howard was led toward one of the cruisers, his face a mask of disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't supposed to happen to him. And yet, as he was pushed into the back seat, the realization hit him like a weight to the chest. It was over. Forever. Meanwhile, Malia turned toward her father. For the first time since this began, she let out a shaky breath. Obama reached out, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. The touch was light, but the meaning behind it was unshakable. She was safe now. And Howard? He would never hurt anyone again. The weight of the moment lingered in the air long after the handcuffs clicked shut around Officer Howard's wrists. The lead officer barely spared him a glance as he guided him toward the back of the police cruiser, his grip firm but devoid of the usual camaraderie officers shared. There was no attempt to soften the humiliation, no quiet words of reassurance that things would blow over. Howard was not being treated as a colleague in an unfortunate situation. He was being treated like a criminal, and that realization burned. The murmurs from the crowd had transformed into a tangible energy, buzzing through the onlookers like a growing storm. People whispered among themselves, exchanging looks of vindication, shock, and satisfaction. The footage of the arrest was already spreading online, finding its way to social media within seconds. Howard could hear the faint chime of notifications from some of the bystanders' phones, a cruel reminder that his downfall was no longer confined to this parking lot. It was spreading. He struggled to breathe, his mind racing for a way out. There had to be a way out. But when he turned his gaze back toward Barack Obama, he knew the truth. There was no escaping this. Obama had not moved from where he stood, his posture unwavering, his presence unshakable. The former president exuded the same quiet strength he had carried through years of scrutiny and adversity. He had seen men like Howard before, bullies cloaked in authority, men who wielded power with reckless abandon, convinced of their own invincibility. And he had watched them fall. Howard sat in the back of the cruiser, his breaths shallow. His mind raced with possibilities, legal loopholes, union protections, some technicality that might save him. But deep down, he already knew. This wasn't going away. The officers shut the door behind him, sealing his fate with a metallic finality. The lead officer, still standing outside the vehicle, turned back toward Obama, his gaze unreadable. There was a certain weight to his movements, as though he were fully aware of the magnitude of this moment. He knew that every action taken here would be dissected, analyzed, and remembered. "Mr. President," he said, his voice even, respectful, "we'll be taking him in for processing. Given the circumstances, I expect this case will escalate quickly." Obama gave a single nod. "I expect so." There was no satisfaction in his voice. No triumph, just truth. Howard had not simply attacked an innocent woman. He had attacked the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the world, and the world was watching. The lead officer hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "If you or your daughter need anything, please let us know. We'll ensure that everything proceeds by the book." Obama's gaze flickered toward Malia. She had been silent throughout most of this, standing with an unshakable composure that had been tested and tempered through years of public scrutiny. She was her father's daughter, strong, steady, but not unbreakable. She shifted slightly, the bruises along her ribs and the dried blood on her lip standing as silent evidence of what had been done to her. Obama turned back to the officer, his voice firm. "I expect nothing less." There was nothing more to be said. The officers moved with silent efficiency, securing the scene as Howard remained motionless in the back seat of the cruiser. He was no longer an active participant in this story. He was simply waiting for judgment to be passed. And it would come swiftly. The moment the cruiser pulled away, the energy in the parking lot shifted once again. The crowd, once held captive by the tension, began to disperse, though not without lingering glances, hushed conversations, and the occasional click of a camera. This would not be forgotten. It would not be forgiven. Somewhere in the distance, a voice murmured, "He messed with the wrong family." And they were right. Obama turned toward Malia. His eyes, so often measured and controlled, softened as he took in the sight of his daughter. She was still standing tall, but he could see the exhaustion in the way her shoulders sagged slightly, the way she held herself as if determined not to let the weight of the moment crush her. Without a word, he placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture simple yet grounding. she exhaled slowly. "I'm fine," she said, though the words lacked their usual conviction. Obama studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Let's go home." The security team moved in seamlessly, ensuring their path was clear as they made their way back toward the waiting SUVs. The world outside was still shifting, still processing what had just unfolded. The news cycle would devour this story, turning it into something larger than life. But for now, it was just a father and his daughter. And for Obama, nothing mattered more than that. As the SUV door shut behind them, sealing them away from the outside world, Malia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her father sat beside her, his presence a silent reassurance. She closed her eyes, allowing the exhaustion to settle in. Justice had been served. But the battle wasn't over. Not yet. The black SUVs moved silently through the streets of Washington, D.C., their tinted windows shielding the occupants from the world outside. Inside one of them, Malia Obama sat in the passenger seat, her head leaning back against the leather headrest. The adrenaline that had carried her through the last hour was wearing off, leaving behind a dull ache in her ribs and a weight in her chest that she couldn't shake. Beside her, Barack Obama sat quietly, his posture relaxed but his gaze distant. He hadn't spoken much since they left the grocery store parking lot, and he didn't need to. The energy in the car was thick with unspoken thoughts, emotions that neither of them had quite processed yet. The events of the evening had unfolded so quickly. One moment, she had been going about a simple grocery run, and the next, she was on the pavement, bruised and breathless, facing down the rage of a man who thought he could act with impunity. And then, her father had arrived. The sheer force of his presence had shifted the entire moment, flipping the balance of power in an instant. The officer who had seemed so untouchable just minutes earlier had been reduced to a trembling figure, his authority stripped away in the face of someone who truly commanded respect. Justice had been served, but why did she still feel so off? She turned her head slightly, looking at her father. He was staring out the window, his jaw tight, lost in thought. For years, she had watched him navigate crises with an unshakable calm, had seen him take insults, disrespect, and outright hatred with a steady hand and a measured response. He had built an entire presidency on the ability to remain poised, to never let his emotions dictate his actions. But tonight, for the first time, she had seen something different. She had seen his rage. It had been brief, just a flicker in his eyes, a tension in his shoulders, but it had been there, and it terrified her. Not because she feared him, but because she understood that he had felt something she had spent years forcing herself not to feel. Helplessness. The SUV slowed as it turned onto their street, pulling up in front of the family's home. Security personnel were already in place, scanning the surroundings, ensuring that everything was as it should be. Even now, even after everything that had happened, the world outside continued as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The moment the car stopped, the door opened, and Malia stepped out, wincing slightly as she moved. The pain in her ribs was a reminder of what had happened, of what could have happened if things had escalated further. Her father stepped out after her, immediately glancing her way. His gaze lingered for just a second longer than usual, as if silently assessing whether she was truly okay. She gave him a small nod, as if to say, "I'm fine," but they both knew that wasn't entirely true. They walked toward the front door, the security detail following at a respectful distance. As soon as they stepped inside, the warmth of home enveloped them. The familiar scent of the house, the dim lighting, the faint hum of music playing somewhere in the background, It all felt so normal, and yet nothing about tonight had been normal. Michelle Obama was already waiting in the living room, her expression unreadable. The second she saw Malia, her composure cracked just enough to reveal the worry beneath. "Oh, baby," she whispered, crossing the room in just a few strides and pulling her daughter into a gentle hug. Malia let herself sink into the embrace for a moment, the warmth of her mother's arms soothing some of the lingering tension in her body. But when she pulled back, Michelle's hands lingered on her shoulders, her gaze scanning over her face. "You're hurt," she said softly. "I'm okay," Malia reassured her, though she wasn't sure if she even believed that herself. Michelle's eyes flickered to Barack, and a silent conversation passed between them. Without a word, she turned and disappeared into the kitchen. A few moments later, she returned with a first aid kit and a bag of ice, sitting down on the couch and motioning for Malia to join her. As Michelle gently dabbed at the cut on her lip, Barack sat down across from them, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers steepled together in thought. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, finally, Michelle broke it. "What happened?" Her voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. Barack exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face before speaking. "An officer, Bradley Howard." His voice was measured, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper. "He stopped her in the parking lot. No reason, just—" He shook his head slightly. "She wasn't doing anything, and he put his hands on her." Michelle's grip on the ice pack tightened. She didn't say anything, but the tension in her posture spoke volumes. Malia, still pressing the ice to her ribs, finally found her voice. "It happened so fast. One minute I was just walking, and the next, he was—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "He hit me, Mom." Michelle inhaled sharply, her hands clenching into fists in her lap. Barack looked down, exhaling slowly. "He's in custody now," he said. "He won't get away with this." Michelle let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "And how many others have?" she murmured, shaking her head. The words stung because they were true. Howard wasn't the first officer to abuse his power. He wouldn't be the last. The only difference this time was that he had chosen the wrong person to target. This time, the world had noticed. Michelle reached out, gently taking Malia's hand. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." "I'm just glad Dad showed up," Malia admitted, glancing at her father. Barack looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. "I wasn't fast enough," he said quietly. Malia frowned. "Dad—" "I should have been there sooner," he continued. "I should have—" He stopped, shaking his head. "When I got that call, I've never felt fear like that in my life." Michelle's eyes softened, and she reached over, placing her hand over his. "We can't protect them from everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Barack exhaled, nodding slowly. "I know." The room fell into silence again, but this time it was different. The weight of the evening still hung heavy in the air, but there was something else now, something stronger. Unity. They were a family. They had faced the worst of what the world could throw at them, and they had come out the other side. Bruised, yes, but not broken. As the hours passed, the house settled into a quiet rhythm again. The exhaustion finally caught up to them, and one by one, they retreated to their rooms. But before she went upstairs, Malia hesitated. She turned back to her father, who was still sitting in the living room, staring into the distance. "Dad?" He looked up. She gave him a small, tired smile. "You were fast enough." His expression softened, and for the first time that night, a hint of a smile ghosted across his lips. She turned and headed upstairs, the weight in her chest a little lighter. Outside, the world continued to turn, the events of the night spreading through news channels and social media like wildfire. There would be discussions, debates, outrage. There would be consequences. But inside their home, for now, there was peace. And that was enough. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Check out more of our videos for stories that keep you thinking. And if this one resonated with you, share it with others. Let's keep the conversation going.